Battle Factory is a challenge that massively levels the playing field. Since the factory gives out rental Pokemon, it doesn't take weeks to breed, reset, RNG manipulate, and train the perfect team to do a challenge. The goal in the Battle Factory is to get the biggest win streak, and world record win streaks require a lot of luck, but almost no mechanical skill. Instead, there's a big emphasis on knowledge and decision making. And, over the years, cheaters have definitely become aware of this. You're going to see exactly why the factory used to be uniquely easy to cheat. And, in modern times, we know a lot more about the factory and about Generation 4. For this reason, reviewing the old Smogon factory leaderboards is both quite funny and a bit horrifying. In this video, we'll go over both confirmed and likely cheaters, but also something much worse and much more concerning. Let's quickly recap the factory mechanics. At the start of each 7 battle set, you must pick 3 Pokemon from a choice of 6 rentals. After you win a game, you can swap one of your Pokemon for one of the Pokemon you just beat on the opponent's team. And then for the next set of 7 games, you must select an entirely new team. If you ever lose a game, the win streak just resets to 0. There are only 950 Pokemon in the factory, and that means some Pokemon have multiple sets. The real menace is the factory's endgame though. The final version of the factory forces you to face off against the game's smartest AI algorithm, while the enemies are using unknown sets. This requires a kind of probabilistic deductive reasoning which is very difficult to master. But the issue is, reaching this endgame is very difficult and can take a lot of time, which means practicing the endgame is very slow, and therefore it takes a long time to improve. Nowadays we know a lot more about how the factory and the AI works, but back in 2009 when the factory first came out, we didn't, and the community got all sorts of things wrong. This made the factory extremely difficult. I remember that as a young kid, the factory gold print took me over a year to get, while the entire rest of the frontier took me under a month. The main place that people gathered in 2009 was Smogon's factory leaderboard. But just how useful or valuable was this? Before going into specific cases, let's talk about some obvious forms of cheating. The most common form of cheating in most games is video splicing, where multiple different runs are edited together to look like one single excellent run, where nothing goes wrong. But long factory runs can take well over 10 hours to complete, and back in 2009, it would have been almost impossible to require users to film and submit full videos of their runs. Every kind of competition has to remember this. If the rules are too extreme and the barrier to entry is too high, no one is even able to compete, and then the competition will suck. But on the other hand, if any user is able to submit whatever they want and have almost no proof standards, then this can also be a disaster. So, Smogon had a 2-stage proof system. Users had to upload some kind of proof, typically a picture of their DS with the record shown. And users also had to provide what Smogon described as an adequate written explanation of how the user got that far. This meant that accessibility was really high. All you had to do to compete was have a DS, a copy of the game, and maybe a camera. But there are some quite obvious ways of cheating this. First, and perhaps most obvious, would simply be to Photoshop the photo of the streak. This was even easier back in 2009, as the image quality was lower and could easily go unnoticed. A cheater could also directly edit the save file. This might sound quite advanced, but there's always been a huge interest in Pokemon to have a way to hack Pokemon into save files. And changing the win streak number in the Battle Factory is significantly easier than that. After setting the streak to whatever they want, they can then just take a genuine picture. These two cheating methods might seem like they would fool almost no one, but let me show an example. This YouTube user has 100% cheated. The video has 67,000 views and no one in the comments has noticed. Can you see why? I'm going to show it again. It's because battles occur in sets of 7. So a streak that is ongoing must be a multiple of 7, and anything else is impossible without hacking or save editing. 394 is not a multiple of 7, and this is definitely cheated. This sounds incredibly stupid, but a lot of cheaters are clueless about the basic mechanics of the game. People did submit streaks with these kinds of errors on the forums, but the obvious ones were all banned. The next obvious cheating method is the dumbest and slowest, but also easily possible. A lot of common cheating devices for the DS came out with cheat codes like automatically win every battle. Entering the Battle Factory with this cheat enabled meant a user could go as far as they liked. And if they wanted to lose, they could just turn the cheat off. The advantage of this is that since the player is going through the game normally, nothing will be wrong with the image proof. But the problem is, if pressed for details about how they cheated, the cheater may be in trouble, since they've almost certainly not played a genuine game at a high skill level. And cheaters often underestimate just how insanely complicated and difficult the factory can get at the highest skill levels. And this is related to another popular proof requirement. See, back in 2009, the Nintendo Global Wi-Fi system for Generation 4 was still active. This let users share battle videos over the internet. What was useful about these battle videos is that if it was done in the battle frontier, it would also display the streak number. This was seen as a slightly more reliable and more convenient proof method for a streak. It didn't require a camera, and it meant that the player definitely played the game at a certain streak count without any obvious cheats turned on. Of course, a user could just cheat before this in the streak, but there's no way of verifying that anyway. Unfortunately, these battle videos are all dead along with the Nintendo Wi-Fi servers for the DS, but the existence of a battle video code in old posts means that we can infer the users felt like they had nothing to hide in sharing these videos. The problem is, there is one more method of cheating that is both simple, cheap, and would get around all of these anti-cheat measures. I will explain this one later in the video. For now, let's have a look at some actual big factory streaks on Smogon from this 2009 era. This first streak was submitted on April 20th of 2009. This matters because Platinum had only been released 1 month earlier, and a very important data mine for the game only occurred on April 11th of 2009. This is about as early as a realistic run submission could ever be. The run in question was done by Blackeye, and Blackeye had got a massive 74 win streak in the factory, providing 2 different images of the streak at different times. To put this into context, 74 is still an amazing record in 2025. This record is also a bit famous because of its timing. As I mentioned before, the factory was proving to be incredibly difficult. The canonical goal set by the game was 49 wins for the gold symbol, but a lot of the very best players could not get this. So Blackeye posting about his 74 win streak dramatically changed the landscape of the factory discussion. Because, to be blunt about it, Blackeye was a bit of a nobody. No one knew who he was. In fact, Blackeye would only ever make 2 posts on the Pokemon forums. Once to say that he had achieved the gold symbol, and another to say that he had lost at match 75. No one else had come anywhere close, although it was still realistically only about 1 week into real attempts. So let's audit what Blackeye actually shared in his posts. Blackeye says he remembers one loss, where he had Kingdra, Gliscor and Weezing versus Pinsir, Venusaur and Starmie. The match in his words went like this. First, Kingdra Hydro Pump KO'd Pinsir, then Kingdra missed Blizzard on Venusaur as Venusaur uses Curse. Then Kingdra hits the Blizzard against Venusaur, and Venusaur KOs Kingdra with Outrage. Weezing then uses Flamethrower to KO Venusaur, and Starmie comes in and cleans up both Weezing and Gliscor. Let's first do the positives and say what makes sense here. First up, the match is very plausible, both teams are possible to generate, and the sets that Blackeye describe do exist in the factory. The move sequences, the way that the match flows, and the way that the AI decides on its moves do make sense given how we know the smart AI operates today. But there are a few red flags here. First up, he says that Outrage surprised him on Venusaur. In the factory, each species only has a few preset sets, that's move and item combinations. When Venusaur used the move Curse, factory players should immediately know that this is the physical Outrage set. Even someone new to the factory can do this, so long as they have the list of all the Frontier sets, which did exist back in April 20th of 2009. In fact, more than just saying they exist, the thread had been talking about these just before Blackeye started posting his records. In other words, if we are to believe what Blackeye says about how he played, he was playing blind into these sets and was not using any lookups or information at all while getting a 74 win streak. In fact, it's clear that he was not thinking about the factory deductive reasoning at all. I'll be blunt about this. It's very suspicious that this kind of set blindness never made him lose before match 75. I don't know anyone, on Smogon or otherwise, in any time period, that has got anywhere close to a 74 win streak without at least knowing a bit about the sets. The second red flag is the damage intuition. Against Pinsir, he chose to move Hydro Pump on Kingdra. Experienced players do not have to bother checking a damage calc like this to know that it's extremely unlikely to kill, and Draco Meteor will be a much better option, since it's both more likely to KO, and Draco Meteor also has higher accuracy. On top of that, Pinsir Kingdra is very likely a speed tie, and Hydro Pump becomes an even worse idea under this guise. Now, to be clear, I never want to gatekeep the Frontier behind having a lot of experience or behind having a lot of damage intuition. But the fact is that anyone new or uncertain can always just run a damage calculation to check something like this. In fact, I'd expect almost everyone to check the damage calc here. I don't find the idea of Blackeye getting the mental damage check wrong to be that concerning, but what I do find concerning is the fact that he never checked either at the time or when doing the write-up. Another much smaller red flag is the fact that Blackeye never provided a battle video here, although it's only a small mark against him. I think the biggest red flag is just being totally risk unaware. This might sound like a simple game, but it's full of details that players should be picking up on, including preserving the Destiny bond on Wheezing. Instead, it reads a bit like a spectator recap, and not the thought process of someone navigating the endgame odds or an expert reflecting on a difficult game. That doesn't prove cheating, but it does make the streak much less instructive. Now, this post alone still makes Blackeye seem quite innocent, particularly if we remember that it's possible he just forgot some details of the battle. So let's check out his other post too. This is about a match from the Battle Arcade against a Dahlia boss encounter. The start of this battle is irrelevant, but then he describes how his Empoleon faced off in an endgame against a Zapdos and a Togekiss. Apparently, Empoleon survives a Thunderbolt from Zapdos, uses agility to boost its speed, and then Patea Berry boosts its special attack. Empoleon is then able to sweep Zapdos and Togekiss with Ice Beam. Now, this agility Empoleon set used to be very popular, so I'm not surprised he's using it. But there are a lot of really odd things here, even without touching a calculator. First, Blackeye never provides the investment or stats for any of these Pokemon. That's highly unusual, even for the time, and it matters a lot for the Zapdos-Empoleon matchup. Surviving Zapdos' Thunderbolt with Empoleon requires a lot of investment in bulk, and that's weird because Agility Empoleon almost never runs any bulk investment. You might say it's a specific counter to this Zapdos, but that's highly unlikely. Remember that the data mine had only just come out. And even if you do run a lot of bulk investment in Empoleon, Zapdos is probably going to KO you anyway. Speaking of the Empoleon investment, from these kills we also know that Empoleon must be almost max in special attack. That's not impossible, but remember that it's impossible to invest in bulk, special attack and speed all at the same time. The next problem is Blackeye saying he used Ice Beam instead of the Torrent boosted Surf. This is a massive mistake. Surf is significantly more stronger under the Torrent boost. It's really weird that someone who built an agility set with Torrent would themselves forget to do this, and also not mention it in the write-up at all. I will also say that the Patea Berry interaction in the arcade roulette is extremely unlikely to align in this way. It's incredible luck from Blackeye if it is true. None of that is impossible, but all of it is pretty weird, and it also contextualizes the Hydro Pump comment in a bit of a different light. You may think that since it's so specific and weird, this actually makes it more likely to be true, because surely a cheater wouldn't invent an obviously outrageous or false story. And if you do think that, you're going to be shocked by a later part of this video. So, did Blackeye actually cheat? We cannot say for certain. It is very suspicious, and it's also obvious that Blackeye is not a good player. However, a lot of people did try and beat the factory, and it seems plausible that out of perhaps millions of attempts, someone would get incredibly lucky. For me personally, the timing of the streak is what I find most suspicious. The game had only just come out, and I wonder if Blackeye wanted to cheat for first, but do it in a not very suspicious way. Every other facility has massive numbers for the win streaks in their world records, so perhaps at the time, 74 seemed like a pretty small lie. The thing is, no one would really come close for about a year. It's now April of 2010. And this is a much shorter one. Yes, it's the entire post. Myth Trainer got 59 wins, which is another strong record. You might think that a write-up this short violates the thread rules about the write-ups, but it was still accepted. This battle video is unfortunately dead along with the Gen 4 Wi-Fi servers, so we have no idea what it is. There is one thing I'm going to say about this one, which is the final sentence. OU and UU are competitive terms for Pokemon that mean almost nothing in the factory. This isn't a good framing, and it's not useful for anyone learning how to get better at the factory. That said, of course, Myth is entitled to his opinion. Since there's basically no information here, it's important that we give players the benefit of the doubt. Myth's record is probably real, and there's no real reason to suspect it. It's a bit dangerous to just assume the mind of a cheater, but we can point out that if Myth was cheating, the appeal probably would have been to beat Blackeye for number 1, rather than submit a distant second place streak. So, 2 months after Myth came the second longest streak in this era of the Smogon factory. Blazade submitted a streak of 63 back in June of 2010. 63 is still a good streak of course, but it's significantly less than 74. This record is actually much simpler to go through. Straight away, a number of differences stand out, particularly compared to Black Eye. First up, Blazade provides some YouTube links to the games played. While these links are now dead, it's additional proof on top of just the battle videos. But more importantly, Blazade refers to the factory sets directly by their 950 set index. This means he was definitely not playing blind, and it also makes his description of his run a lot easier to follow. Of course, this doesn't guarantee that Blazade was not cheating, but it's a lot more helpful for other players to understand some of the basics of how the frontier works. Blazade then describes some of the Pokemon he used on the teams to go from 49 to 56, and then from 56 to 63. These include some of the very best Pokemon in the entire factory. This isn't meant as an insult to Blazade, but part of what I meant earlier when I said that luck matters. Here it applies that certain rental teams are so strong that it's very difficult to lose. In this way, a bit of luck can carry almost anyone. Blazade's description of his loss is quite straightforward. It's Flygon, Gardevoir and Aggron against Gallade, Gengar and Swampert. Flygon hits Gallade with Draco Meteor, but unfortunately it's revealed to be Gallade 2 with Ice Punch, so Flygon faints. Gardevoir then takes out Gallade after being hit by it. Then Gengar comes out and finishes off Gardevoir. While Aggron then got revenge on Gengar, Swampert followed this by getting revenge on Aggron, leading to a loss. In terms of suspicions, almost nothing about this is suspicious at all. All of these sets are real and do exist, none of these calculations or AI behaviours are wrong, and the decision making is logical, and Blazade didn't make any huge mistakes. If I was going to be ultra critical of Blazade here, I would say that the decision to lead Flygon instead of Aggron is inaccurate. And also that when Gengar came in against Gardevoir, he probably should have switched to Aggron. However, these criticisms are very small, and from a logical perspective, it's entirely plausible that Blazade reached 63 wins while playing like this. While we obviously cannot be completely certain that this is not cheated, I do think that if we're going to believe anyone from this era of Smogon, it should be users like Blazade. This next case is also quite a short one. Team Rocket Elite is a known legend on these threads, and his contributions to understanding how the factory worked are extremely helpful. In fact, he is the user who originally shared the data mine on display for all possible Frontier sets. On top of this, he also did a recap in July 2010 of his 56 win streak in the Battle Factory. Once again, we cannot be totally certain that it's legit, but there's really no reason at all to doubt this. He mentions that he lost to a Dugong hitting 3 out of 3 sheer colds, which is actually not that unlikely, since it corresponds to about a 2.7% chance. In fact, almost every single Frontier player, including myself, has had that happen to them. Just like Blazade, this kind of post is about as trustworthy as it can be given the time that it was shared. And once again we can point out, a lot like with Blazade and Myth Trainer, that if Team Rocket Elite was cheating, the temptation would surely be to take the number 1 spot. In fact, Team Rocket Elite was such a strong player, and the respect for him was so high, that people were perhaps surprised he was not in the top 3 in the factory. The most suspicious thing about Team Rocket Elite here is perhaps the fact that he only reached 56 wins. But enough of the honest players. Let's wind the clock back to March of 2010 and go over the longest streak submitted to Smogon ever. For privacy reasons, I'm going to redact the name of this next player. I'm just going to call them Polar. 104 is a massive number, but this streak is almost certainly cheated. This streak was shared over 3 separate posts on the thread and is full of some bizarre patterns. First, let's recap about exactly what we should expect from a cheater. As long as they aren't totally new, it's actually quite easy to come up with a somewhat convincing story for how you lost. For example, you could just say you lost to a Pokemon like Latios 3 or Garchomp 4. And since this was all done over forum posts, if a cheater needed to, they could have all the time in the world to research, plan, or fake a game or look up any answers to any questions that were trying to catch them out. In the first few posts by Polar, they shared the total win streak, along with some images as proof. There's also a sentence about struggling against the Pokemon Credilli 2, which is bizarre since this is one of the absolute worst sets in the factory. Now technically, no rules had been broken. Yes, 104 is a massive streak for this era, but it's not totally impossible. Polar was providing clear images showing the streak and talking about it, and Polar was also a known member and contributor to the Smogon community, and would actually continue to be so after this drama. Now, most records on the thread do not come under that much fire. Indeed, all discussed previous examples were accepted without any discussion at all. But perhaps the most famous player in all of Generation 4, Jumpman16, took issue with Polar's posting. And these posts are quite strange. They are full of smug little brags about schoolwork and borderline LARPing about what they were doing in real life while playing Factory. Jumpman specifically pointed out that most players struggle to get 100 wins in the Battle Tower, let alone the Battle Factory, and this is certainly true. But Jumpman is also a bit sneaky here by implying that Factory streaks maybe need more proof. This isn't technically true and it's not in the rules. In fact, Polar did not have to provide any more evidence here at all. A completely legit player's honest response could just be that they don't really remember a lot. They also had the opportunity to just say some vague and evasive things like I mentioned earlier. But I think Jumpman could sense that given Polar's inflated ego and grandiose statements, that they probably weren't going to back down. Now Polar took an entire day to respond, which is plenty of time to either help remember the streak if it was legit, or to make up a good lie if he had been cheating. Polar's post ended up hitting on a few points. First, Polar comments on the photo quality and glare on the screen, and says that because of this, it can't easily be photoshopped. However, as we're about to see, that is probably irrelevant. Polar then assures Jumpman that he has an excellent memory and can recall a lot of what happened. Apparently a lot of luck was involved, but he had a winning strategy of taking fast Pokemon with good type coverage. Now on its own, this is a small red flag. New players often say this, and unfortunately it's just not true. The truth is the best Pokemon in the factory do not rely on type coverage because they don't need to. But that alone definitely does not make him a cheater. Polar then points out a few specific Pokemon that worked well for him in the run, including the Sceptile set 4. Polar also mentions that he thinks the Endure reversal sets are very strong. This Endure reversal comment is also quite funny to read about in 2025, given the major difference in opinion between the Japanese and Western player bases on these sets. But it's also really important to reframe the discussion and remember something. Polar is claiming 104 wins, which is a massive world record. If they are legit, they are almost certainly doing something differently to everyone else, so we shouldn't be too caught out by any kind of unusual opinions. And that brings us to the next part of this post. Polar specifically mentions a battle featuring Sceptile, Typhlosion and Togekiss versus Kingdra, Dragonite and Medicham at Battle 103. To quote Polar here, Sceptile easily beat Kingdra and Dragonite with Dragon Pulse, and then Medicham came out. Medicham endured and activated its Select Berry on Leaf Storm, and then KO'd both Sceptile and Togekiss with Zen Headbutt. Finally, Polar's own Typhlosion used an Endure and activated its own Select Berry to outspeed the Medicham, and then it won with the move Blast Burn. Now this is a massive mistake, and it's why we absolutely know that Polar cheated. There are 3 very serious problems here. First up is a comment about Sceptile beating both Kingdra and Dragonite with Dragon Pulse. The thing is, even though Dragon Pulse is super effective, Sceptile absolutely cannot kill either one with it. In fact, even if Dragon Pulse crits, Dragonite is quite likely to survive. This is a big error to make, not just because it means that the story doesn't line up with a realistic battle at all, but also because it betrays the idea that Polar has absolutely any damage sense for calculations. There's absolutely no way that he even checked this with a damage calculator before posting it. In the thread, Jumpman and Chinese Dude both immediately noticed this strange Dragon Pulse comment in his post. But the Dragon Pulse is actually the least condemning piece of evidence in here. You see, the factory obeys a rule called Item Clause. Put simply, you can never face an enemy with the same item as you. This makes the matchup of Select-Berry Typhlosion versus Select-Berry Medicham actually impossible. If it was any other item, perhaps literally any other item, we could probably dismiss this as misremembering. But it's clear that Polar specifically remembers this fight because of the double Select-Berry activation. And Polar themselves drew a lot of attention to this part. It's unreasonable to believe that they could be wrong about the most memorable part of the battle. This alone makes the battle fake, and very likely the streak also fake. But incredibly, there's another huge problem here. The smart AI would never use Endure with Medicham on turn 1 against Sceptile. It would always use Fake Out into Zen Headbutt, and this combination of moves would always kill Sceptile if they landed. This alone would also be enough evidence to reject the battle as fake. But there are actually even more issues with this battle, like the fact that Zen Headbutt would not get these KOs on Polar's Pokemon, and the fact that the smart AI would always use the move Reversal and not Zen Headbutt here. And then even on the final turn, Polar should never use the move Blast Burn since it can miss. The correct choice would have been Earthquake or Reversal since these both have 100% accuracy. It's actually very impressive that despite having lots of free time and free reign to invent whatever match he wanted, Polar came up with a match which was actually completely impossible, and there were issues with every single turn of the match. This is then made even worse by the fact that Polar signs out saying that he worked hard and sincerely, and also wanted to apologise if he sounded too condescending. After all of these issues and more were pointed out, Polar never actually returned to the thread. Clearly requesting more information out of cheaters is actually quite a good way to catch them. If all of that wasn't enough, there's actually one final piece of information which Jumpman didn't mention. See, to lose at 104 means that Polar lost a final game in the set of 7. This isn't impossible of course, but it is slightly unusual. As you go through the set of 7 games, you get more and more swap chances, which means that your team should be getting better and better on average. In other words, a factory run is likely to be lost near the start of a set, and less likely to be lost near the end of the set. That's not proof of cheating, but on top of everything else, it's even more reason to add doubt. You might be wondering how Polar cheated. While it could be simple save editing or photoshopping, I suspect instead that Polar just saved scum to 100. The way this works is quite simple. In Pokemon you only ever get one save file. The factory will force you to save before entering, and if you turn the power off and on again, it will just assume that you lost and set your streak back to 0. In other words, that's a simple defense against save scumming in the factory. So instead, all a cheater has to do is make a backup of this save off the save file. There are a huge number of ways to do this, even back in 2010. For example, let's say Polar had a streak of 70, and he makes a backup of that save. He goes in and tries to win a set of 7 games. If he wins, he'll make a new backup of the file at 77 wins. If he loses, he reloads the backed up save at 70 wins and starts again at 70. Then he plays again and again until he hits 77. He then repeats this until he gets to 100. This method of save scumming means that the player will of course never lose unless they want to. It does seem very convenient that Polar's first loss is on the first set of 7 games that goes past 100. It's also possible that Polar played on an emulator using save states on an emulator, and then simply transferred this save file onto a DS cartridge. It would be impossible to verify if this happened also. The reason I suspect Polar did this instead of just doing a simple Photoshop is because of a few small comments he makes throughout the post talking about the factory. Although, of course, I can't know this. Now, you might take issue with this video. Am I perhaps cherry-picking bad examples to bias the narrative? Well, the previous 5 examples were all the biggest claims on the thread, excluding banned users who have posts that we can no longer view. Keep in mind that lying about a streak or submitting a fake streak doesn't actually get you banned from Smogon, which is why Polar was never actually banned for this. But to avoid claims of cherry picking, why don't we pick an extremely trusted user? The person who just caught out Polar seems like a good place to start. So what about Jumpman? What does Jumpman's best factory streak look like? A post he made in June of 2009. As context, Jumpman is known for his very long, detailed, and sometimes overly dramatic posts about the frontier. Jumpman is also known for being basically the only user in the entire thread who would call out other users for being suspicious. Jumpman's factory post is very long, but let me summarise some points about it. First, Jumpman correctly describes the swap IV interaction. Back in 2009, the thread had no idea how this worked. It was impossible to guess at it. So at minimum, we definitely know that Jumpman entered and did play the factory. Second, Jumpman clearly played the factory quite well in the context of 2009. In fact, at this level, he'd be considered a strong player by today's standards also. In particular, I was impressed by Jumpman's lead choice decisions and logic, as well as Jumpman's analysis including set deduction and approximate damage discussions, including a good sense for how the AI worked, given that no one actually knew exactly how it did work back in 2009. Now, Jumpman discusses 4 battles in full. This is a lot more than most others, and it's also why the post is so long. Jumpman also links to a battle video that was shared on the Nintendo servers at the time. Given the popularity of Jumpman's posts, this was almost certainly viewed heavily. Jumpman also provides a lot of insight on his thought process. This alone probably makes this post the single most helpful resource on the entire internet for how to beat the factory in the 10 years following. However, the praise ends there. This post is also full of mistakes, bad plays, and just flat out lies. Let's go through a few basic ones before we talk about the real smoking gun here. First up, Jumpman hallucinates the existence of Expert Belt Latios. This simply does not exist at all in the Frontier, and if Jumpman had checked while writing this post, he would know that. Second, Jumpman describes a switch from Rapidash to Drifloon, but that is literally impossible. We know for a fact exactly how the Gen 4 Smart AI mid-turn switch decision logic works. What Jumpman posted here cannot happen. Also, while Jumpman does mention various damage calcs here, he is consistently, and I mean consistently, wrong about basically every single one listed throughout this post, and there's around 20. And he's not just slightly wrong in the way that I'm slightly wrong about some mental damage calculations, but categorically wrong even if we account for somewhat random IVs. This is probably the single weirdest thing about this post, as Jumpman is known for being very accurate and very specific with his damage calculations. Jumpman also makes a few specific inaccuracies in the game recaps which he doesn't seem to notice. This includes things like not using Thunder Punch with Ambipom versus Rapidash, but instead using Double Hit, which has a 10% miss chance. I call these inaccuracies instead of outright mistakes, but given his reputation, I am surprised that Jumpman didn't notice them when he was writing them up. Now the absolute worst mistake made here is also something that Jumpman notes. In Venusaur 3 vs Ludicolo 2 matchup, Ludicolo can do literally nothing against Venusaur. Even if we never hit a single move against it after it uses Double Team, it's still going to die to its own struggle recoil damage. In this scenario, Venusaur should absolutely do a full curse setup. Jumpman doesn't do this, which is a very rookie mistake. This might feel like nitpicking, but I will triple underline that it's very weird for Jumpman to ever be wrong about anything in a post. And this one post is full of so many errors. But I haven't even got to the most damning part yet. So Jumpman recaps Battle 49 in great detail. This is the gold symbol fight in the factory, and clearly also his main goal. Because this was played back in 2009, Jumpman had no idea that this boss encounter will only use set 4 Pokemon, and so his post follows logic that is ignorant of this. But that's fine, and expected even. The fight starts out with Ambipom beating Flygon with Ice Punch. This is an excellent start. Next in is Staraptor. This is tricky because after Intimidate, Staraptor will beat Ambipom. Jumpman decides that he'd rather Staraptor KO Venusaur than Ambipom. This is a pretty subjective decision, so sure. The good news is that after Staraptor 4 takes recoil damage, Ambipom can easily kill it, meaning Jumpman should face off against a final Pokemon in a 2v1 scenario, and that should be a very likely win. Instead of this, Jumpman has a horrible misclick. While going to check Latios' speed, he accidentally clicks Switch. So Staraptor kills Latios for free. This may sound incredibly dumb and stupid, but every single person who's played a lot of Pokemon has had this happen and can relate to this. Maybe it's a little bit shocking from Jumpman, who again was known for his supposed zero mistake gameplay, but it can happen. So instead, Ambipom takes out Staraptor, and Ambipom is alone in the final 1v1. In comes Cradily. Now, without going into too much detail, this is extremely bad because of the item Life Orb. Ambipom's Life Orb is going to deal 10% HP recoil damage to it on every single attack it uses. Cradily is going to survive 2 Ice Punches, and Jumpman is very likely to lose. So the first turn happens. Ice Punch and Stone Edge are used, and Jumpman says that Ambipom drops down to 38 out of 284 HP. That's really bad news, but miraculously, Stone Edge misses on the next turn, which gives Ambipom 2 more chances to use Ice Punch and win. But hold on a second, that's impossible. If Ambipom was at 38 HP left, then 2 more Ice Punch recoil would do 56 damage. So Ambipom would faint on the second Ice Punch, even if Cradily missed its attack. Since a draw in the factory counts as a loss, Jumpman should absolutely always lose this game. Credit goes to Altissimo for being the first to point this out to me a number of weeks ago. Now, maybe you don't know what to think about that, but let me tell you this, it's weird, really weird. Let's get something out of the way first. Did Jumpman cheat? I seriously doubt it. The write-up on Life Orb detail is wrong, but given Jumpman also shared the battle video, it's likely he simply forgot or got this detail wrong in the write-up. Legit streaks from legit players can of course have mistakes in their write-ups. It's surprising from Jumpman specifically, but it can happen to anyone. Now perhaps in hindsight this makes some of his comments against Polar seem hypocritical, but regardless, no, that's not actually the weird part. The weird part is that this is one of the most famous posts on the Smogon thread. Thousands of people must have read this, if not more. Several of them would have been extremely strong players, and yet no one ever noticed his huge mistakes on damage calculators or on the Life Orb detail. Seriously, if anyone had proofread this and mentioned any of the details, they would have been given a lot of clout for mentioning it, and they would mention it. But no, there was just nothing. This also reminds me of the 67,000 view video on YouTube, which also had an impossible streak number, and no one seemed to notice that either. And I think there's a lesson in both. See, the fact that these two things were so heavily viewed means that there was kind of a fake proof put on them. It's the idea that no one has ever called this out, So why should anyone else notice? Why should I bother checking it? Surely someone else checked it. And the longer this goes on, the more everyone is going to assume that this is correct, and also assume that it has no mistakes. After all, how can thousands of people be wrong? This stands in strong contrast to the conclusion we reached with Polar, where asking cheaters to share more details would help us catch cheaters. The truth is, people just never check this stuff. And the irony with Jumpman specifically is that if there had been one more Jumpman on the thread, he would have caught Jumpman out for this. In fact, Jumpman discussed exactly this in the case with Polar, where he says he doesn't like having to be the primary police for this thread, but it seems like no one else is ever going to do it. But it's obvious that Jumpman didn't voice concerns about every single post, only about the most egregious world record claims. And this really makes me wonder how many records or posts are just wrong. Not only in the Smogon Frontier thread, but everywhere, including YouTube or Reddit or whatever. I think the vague idea that people will look at it, and that other people will find problems, and it's not any single person's job to properly check, is not a system that is going to work. I'm not sure this actually ruins the historical thread though. As I said at the start, accessibility is really important for leaderboards like this, and accessibility works in two ways. First, of course, it needs to not be stupidly inconvenient or annoying to participate. If the rules stated that every submission needs a massive Jumpman tier essay, the leaderboards would literally be almost completely empty. And second, it needs to be possible to moderate. Perhaps a small blame should land on Pitaco's lap for not fact-checking Jumpman on every single point. Perhaps we can also be reasonable about this, and say that expecting 1 or 2 mods to check every single post on a massive thread like this is just not sustainable. 2009 is a very different era, of course, but I'm curious on what you think about any of these cases, and also what you think about the submissions of records that have no direct livestream evidence. Let me know in the comments. Now, you might also be curious about our modern knowledge of the Generation 4 factory, and I have good news. I cover how to play the factory in great detail in this next video. Thanks for watching.